Because of this, using ions to directly signal onto the next cell isn't practical. There are no sky bridges connecting these two buildings. Instead, chemical synapses came up with a different way to send their messages. Remember the presynaptic terminal? Let's think of it as a cellular post office. In the presynaptic terminal, you can find these itty-bitty spherical structures called vesicles. Think of them like envelopes. These vesicles are little pockets of membrane that hold the information to be transmitted, keeping the message contained until the post office of the synapse is told to release the information. Inside each vesicle are chemicals known as neurotransmitters. Quite literally, these molecules transmit information between neurons. These are like the letters contained within the envelope. As the signal arrives into the presynaptic terminal, it tells these vesicles to move to the edge of the cell, where the vesicle membrane fuses with the cell membrane and opens up, dumping its contents into the synaptic cleft. Once the neurotransmitters reach the postsynaptic terminal, they attach to receptors. You can think of these receptors like a mailbox. The neurotransmitter binds to the portion of the receptor that sticks out of the cell membrane, and the information they contain is interpreted by the receptor into some kind of response. Sometimes that response means opening an ion channel attached to the receptor itself, letting ions flow and changing the electrical potential of the cell, like we talked about.
So the work of neurotransmitters is to open the receptors, okay? بتفتح receptors. So when the receptors open, بيصير في عندي change of ions، يعني بيصير في عندي passive way، okay؟ للions بفوت مثل ما كنا عم نحكي بالنسبة للأكشن potential.
Last video. Often, the receptor passes the message along to other proteins that rush off into the cell to make other kinds of changes that will affect the electrical potential. There are many different kinds of neurotransmitters, but two of the most common are glutamate, found at glutamatergic synapses, and GABA-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, found GARs, opening a pore that lets negative ions into the cell, which makes it harder for the cell to fire an action potential because the inside of the cell becomes even more negative than normal.
اوكي هون عم تحكي كيف شرحت لكم الاكشن بوتنشال بيفتحوا التشانلز وبفوت الايونز ال Na+ لجوا. لما يمرق ال Na+ لجوا يعني صارت جوا more negative. اوكي
The B receptors are called metabotropic receptors. They're the kind I mentioned before, where the receptor sends off a messenger protein to signal elsewhere in the cell, generally resulting in the same thing, making the inside of the cell more negative to prevent it from firing a signal. Hang on. If your brain has to fire action potentials in order to send a signal, why would an inhibitory signal be useful? Yeah. Well, it can help prevent your brain from sending too many signals.
مرة قلتوا لي إنه ليش الجسم بده يعمل inhibition ما زال إنه لا أنا بتمرق المسج. مش دايما إنه إذا كان في عندي excitation يعني يكون في عندي stimulation بالأحرى يكون important إنه no to send the message على البرين و to feel it ونعمل action. لأنه for example دايما تذكروا الفيلينج بالبين يعني الوجع لما تكونوا مريضين انتوا بتقولوا تاخدوا دواء تتوقفوا هذا الفيلينج. So دايما يس وليد
ايش يعني inhibit يعني
inhibitory يعني بيمنع prevent okay prevent to do something.
قصدي بشو هي بالسينابس؟
النيورو ترانسميتر بيكون شغله انه تمنع يوصل المسج فور اكزامبل جابا عطتنا اوكي
at once. Too much signaling can be just as bad as too little. It helps your cells fine-tune their firing. For example, a cell might receive an excitatory signal followed quickly by an inhibitory signal, so it turns off very quickly and can't fire again right away. So now you have a broad overview of the synapse. It's crazy to think that this structure gives your brain the precise tuning and communication it needs to let you walk, talk, breathe, eat, sleep, think, and be who you are while moving through the environment around you. But it's true, our brains wouldn't be much good without the synapse. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to become a brainiac.
اوكي فكانت عم بتقول انه مثلا الجسم يمكن يعمل inhibitory و excitatory ورا بعض، يعني عرفتوا مثلا for example شفتوا شي بيضحك a scene that made you laugh، اوكي بتضحكوا كتير 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 كتير، مثلا يمكن عيونكم بصيروا يدمعوا for example، مش كل الوقت حيضلوا يدمعوا، بعد شوي البرين بيقول انه ستوب، فبيرجع بيبعت الانهبيتوري انه خلص ما بقى نضحك، بيوقف مجرى الدم. اوكي كل شيء بنعمله نحرك ايدنا، مثلا بنسمع غنية بنقوم نرقص، بعد شوي لا خلص بتوقف الغنية، لا بوقف. فدايما في الكونتراست، دايما في العكس، اوكي الاوبوزيت من النيورو ترانسميترز، هنا بيشتغلوا. اوكي هيدا الكويستشن، هيدا الفيديو خلص، هيدا طويل ما بعرف. did you watch yesterday these videos or not? I sent them on Google Classroom. guys
أنا حضرت بس اللي حضرناهم امبارح، رجعت عدتهم.
اوكي هيدا تقريبا شي 15 minutes. اوكي so هيدا in details، يعني كيف بتفوت بقلبها وكيف بتمشي. هلا في قصص you didn't see it ما بيأثر، لأنه بيكون مش مطلوب عندكم بالبروجرام.
بس سؤال،
ايه
هو الانهبيتوري جلاندز بينفرزوا لحتى يمنعوا المسج توصل، ولا بيوصلوا مسج انه ما بدي مثلا اعمل الشغله؟
انت قلت جملة فيها غلط. we don't say inhibitory glands, we say neurotransmitters. هيدي first. اوكي
ماشي.
تاني شغلة شو الكويستشن؟ انه
هن بيمنعوا المسج انه توصل، ولا بيوصلوا مسج انه ما بدي اعمل هيدا الشيء؟
لا ما قالت لك هي ما يعني الاكشن بوتنشال بتوقفه بالفاير. لما تقول هي كلمة فاير يا ماس، قصدها بالفاير انه المسج يعني يعمل اكشن بوتنشال مثل ما درستوه قبل وتمشي المسج. لما تقلي prevent to do a fire بالسيل، يعني معناتها بتمنع انه توصل المسج.
اوكي
هلا ممكن ليك ممكن توصل المسج انه عكس، بس حسب ما هي حكيت بالفيديو. اوكي قالت انه لا بتعمل prevention انه توصل المسج حتى توقف. اوكي
بس بعد في غيره هالفيديو؟
هيدا last فيديو حاطط لكم هون، لأنه امبارح حسيتكم ضايعين بالنيورو ترانسميتر، حطيت لكم few of them. اوكي you have the most important neurotransmitter found in the body، هو مش للحفظ. out of 100 اوكي في عندي 100، تخيلوا في عندنا 100 neurotransmitter are very important in our body. so we have a few here. حاط لكم المين لوكيشن وين بينفرزوا، ما ضروري تقروهم، بس إذا if you want to take an information. وهون شو بيعملوا؟ واحد عن الموفمنت، maintaining state of awakening mood regulation، هذا تبعول نورا ادرينالين، تبعولة يعني الفيقة والمود. اوكي تحسين المزاج. دوبامين regulations of emotional state، هو اللي الدوبامين اللي بيتأثر بتبول المشاعر. emotional state orders of complex movements. عشان هيك بقول لكم شو انبسطتوا طلع الدوبامين عندكم، يعني لما شخص يقول لكم طلع الدوبامين عندكم it means regulations of emotional state. في عندي السيروتونين هو temperature regulations، مثلا هلا في عندكم برد برا، الجسم بيصير يعدل درجة الحرارة انه انا ما اخسر كتير هيت. اوكي مين بيكون عم يشتغل which neurotransmitter؟ we have serotonin sensory perception and sleeping، كمان بيأثر على النوم. we have GABA inhibitory synapses اللي هن بيمنعوا انه توصل المسج اذا خلص it's have to stop it has sorry ضيعنا. substance P transmission of pain messages، هذا اللي بينقل الوجع. اوكي endorphins decrease of pain. هذا بيستخدموه بالأدوية يعني حكم البنج. كل شيء دواء مخفف وجع بتقولوا عطاء إبرة مورفين، صح؟ كل شيء بينتهي بفين
صح.
بالأخير هو بيخفف الوجع. الهرمون الطبيعي اللي بجسم الإنسان اسمه اندورفينز هو مسؤول عن الوجع، بخفف الوجع، هيدا الطبيعي. فنحن لما نكون مريضين أو شيء بيستخدموا لنا أشياء ميديكيشن كرمال تساعدنا يروح الوجع أكتر. وأنكفاليس قلنا هو شو بسموه للسيرجريز، ساعدوني بالعربي، البنج. اوكي، سو هيدا بيستخدموه بالبنج. خدتوا فكرة تقريبا نيورو ترانسميترز شو بيشتغلوا؟ مش كله نفس الشيء ومش كله مكتشف بعد. وبلس في عندي شيء أهم شيء. so you have here 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 out of 100 neurotransmitters that you have in your body. Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay.
I think we have a decent idea of how a signal is transmitted along a neuron. We saw that, a couple of dendrites, maybe that one and that one and that one, might get excited or triggered. And when we say it gets triggered, we're saying that some type of channel gets opened. That's probably the trigger. That channel allows ions to be released into the cell, or actually there's situations where ions can be released out of the cell. It would be inhibitory, but let's take the case where ions are released into the cells in an electrotonic fashion. It changes the charge or the voltage gradient across the membrane, and if the combined effects of the change in the voltage gradient is just enough at the axon
We're
hillock
talking
to meet
about
that
the action potential, okay?
threshold, then the sodium channels over here will open up. So sodium floods in, and then we have the situation where the voltage becomes very positive. Potassium channels open up to change things again. But by the time we went very positive, then that electrotonically affects the next sodium pump, and then we have this situation where that will allow sodium ions to flood in, and then the signal keeps getting transmitted. Now, the next natural question is what happens at the neuron-to-neuron junctions. We said that
just هيدا البوينت، يعني مطرح ما يخلص السوما وملزق بالاكسون we call it axon hulk. Okay?
We said that this dendrite gets triggered or gets excited, and in most cases it's getting triggered or excited by another neuron. It could be something else. And over here, when this axon fires, it should be exciting either another cell, it could be a muscle cell, or in probably most cases of the human body, it's exciting another neuron. And so how does it do that? So this is the terminal end of the axon. There could be the dendrite of another neuron right here. So this is another neuron right there. I'm not drawing it that well, but I think you get the other idea. This is another neuron with its own axon, its own cell. And so this would trigger the dendrite right there. So the question is, how does that happen? How does the signal go from one neuron's axon to the next neuron's dendrite? It actually always doesn't have to go from axon to dendrite, but that's the most typical. You can actually go from axon to axon, dendrite to dendrite, axon to soma. But let's just focus on axon to dendrite because that's the most traditional way that neurons transmit information from one to the other. So let's zoom in. Let's zoom in right here. This little box right there. Let's zoom in at the base, the terminal end of this axon, and let's zoom in on this whole area. And then we'll also zoom in. We're also going to get the dendrite of this next neuron, and I'm going to rotate it. Actually, I don't even have to rotate it. So to do that, let me draw the terminal end. So let's say the terminal end looks something like this. I've zoomed in big time. It looks something like that. This is the terminal end of the neuron. This is inside. This is inside the neuron. And then the next dendrite, let me draw it right here. The next dendrite, the dendrite of the next neuron. Let me put it right there. So we've really zoomed in. So this is dendrite of next neuron. This is inside the first neuron. So we have this action potential that keeps traveling along. Eventually, you know, for maybe right over here, I don't know if you can zoom in, which would be over here, the action potential makes the electrical potential or the voltage potential across this membrane just positive enough to trigger this sodium channel. So then this sodium, so I'm really, you know, maybe I'm getting really, maybe I'm really close. This channel is this one right here. So then it allows a flood of sodium to enter the cell. It allows a flood of sodium. And then the whole thing happens. You have potassium that can then take it out. But by the time this comes in, this positive charge, it can trigger another channel. And it could trigger another sodium channel if there's other sodium channels further down. But near the end of the axon, there are actually calcium channels. Calcium channels. I'll do that in pink. So this is a calcium
we
channel.
have an action potential لما يصير في عندي trigger لأنه يفتح ال channels الموجودين ثابت إنه at the end of the axon we have calcium channel. So بصيروا بيفتحوا لأنه صار في عندي صوديوم كتير جوا.
This is a calcium channel that is traditionally closed. So this is a calcium ion channel. Calcium has a +2 charge. Calcium ion channel. It tends to be closed, but it's also voltage gated. When the voltage gets high enough, it's very similar to a sodium gated or a sodium voltage gated channel, is that if it becomes positive enough near the gate, it will open up. And when it opens up, it allows calcium ions to flood into the cell. So the calcium ions, they're +2 charge, to flood into the cells. Now you're saying, hey Sal, why are calcium ions flooding into the cells? These have positive charge. I just thought you said that the cell was becoming positive because of all of the sodium flowing in. Why would this calcium want to flow in? And the reason why it wants to flow in is because the cell also, just like it pumps out sodium and pumps in potassium, the cell also has calcium ion pumps. And the mechanism is nearly identical to what I showed you on the sodium potassium pump, but it just deals with calcium. So you literally have these proteins that are sitting across the membrane. You know, this is a phosphobilipid layer membrane, so maybe I should just draw it. Maybe I'll draw 2 layers here just so you realize it's a bilayer.
It's not important. ما بدي إياكم تعرفوها بالنسبة للبروتين. Okay, just إنه الكالسيوم بفوت لجوا وخلص.
Membrane. Let me draw it like that. That makes it look a little bit more realistic, although the whole thing is not very realistic. And this is also going to be a bilipid membrane. I think you get the idea, but let me just do it just to make the point clear. So there are subsets of ATPases, which they just like the sodium potassium pumps. You give them one ATP, and a calcium will bond, pull apart the phosphate from the ATP, and that'll be enough energy to change the calcium out. Or essentially, what was the calcium will bond. It's just like the sodium potassium pumps, but just it's good to know that in the resting state you have a high concentration of calcium ions out here. It's all driven by ATP, a much higher concentration on the outside than you have on the inside. It's driven by those ion pumps. Sodium gate, it starts triggering calcium gates. And these calcium ions flood into the terminal end of this axon. Now, these calcium ions, they bond to other proteins. And before I go to those other proteins, we have to keep in mind what's going on near this junction right here. And I've used the word synapse already. Actually, maybe I haven't. The place where where this axon is meeting with this dendrite, this is the synapse. This is the synapse. This is the synapse. Communication point, or the connection point. And this neuron right here, this is called the presynaptic neuron. Let me write that down. Presynaptic neuron. This is the postsynaptic neuron. Postsynaptic cleft. And it's a really small space in the terms of, so what we're going to deal with in this video is a chemical synapse. In general, when people talk about synapses, they're talking about chemical synapses. There also are electrical synapses, but I won't go into detail on those. This is kind of the most traditional one that people talk about. So your synaptic cleft in chemical synapses is about 20 nanometers.
Okay, wait, time is
which
over
is
بس رح كفي بس just 2 minutes وبعمل and I will stop sharing, okay? Just 1 to 2 minutes.
really small. If you think about the average width of a cell is about, well, depending on your view, 10 to 100 microns. That's 10. A micron is 10 to the minus 6. This is 20 times 10 to the big the cells look next to this small distance. So it's a very small distance, and you have these vesicles. Remember what vesicles were? These are just membrane-bound. These are just membrane-bound things inside of the cell. So you have these vesicles. They also have their phospholipids.
Okay. Next time I will let you to see هون بس كيف لأنه هو عم يحكي in details وكتير حلو هيدا الفيديو. Okay, so next time أكيد رح نبلش بالجريد grade 11 البوك. So prepare it for the next time, okay? و put aside عندكم الدفتر كرمال نبلش نكتب على الدفتر إذا في شيء كتيبة. Okay, good. وهيدي I'm going to send it على الواتساب دغري هيك to just read it.
بس يعني حنخلص من النيرف سيستم.
Yes, finally.
Can't
Yes.
wait, teacher.
Okay. يلا لا وينو حسين لقال له have a nice weekend. اوكي يلا باي باي.
عليكم السلام.